I am standing on the porch of my freshly painted brick colonial, the morning mist still clinging to the impeccably manicured lawns of Cypress Creek Estates, nursing a mug of dark roast that burns the back of my throat in the best possible way, watching a scene unfold across the street with the kind of hyper-realistic, cinematic clarity that usually only exists in the movies. As a woman I have come to know intimately as the architect of my recent nightmares, Margaret Kensington, the undisputed, iron-fisted president of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, literally falls to her knees on her driveway, weeping not for a lost loved one or a sudden tragedy, but because a very tired-looking process server in a wrinkled gray suit has just handed her a stack of federal legal documents thick enough to stop a bullet. I never wanted to be the guy who nuked a neighborhood's local economy, the phantom menace who sent property values plummeting into a temporary freefall while a swarm of high-priced, ruthless attorneys picked the bones of the association clean, because all I genuinely wanted, the only thing I craved after giving 20 years of my youth and the cartilage in my knees to the United States military, was a quiet patch of grass where my dog could relieve himself without a neighborhood tribunal being summoned to judge my very existence. But the absolute truth of the matter is that they started it, or more specifically, Margaret started it. And if there is one indisputable fact I carried home from my deployments, one survival mechanism branded into my psyche, it is that you never, ever throw the first punch, but when the fight comes to your doorstep, you finish it with an overwhelming, earth-shattering force that ensures they never look your way again. Let's rewind the tape about 2 months back to a time when I still possessed a shred of optimism regarding the general decency of suburbanites, having just retired and secured a nice, quiet house in Naperville, Illinois, a picturesque suburb close enough to the Chicago skyline that I could easily make my appointments at the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center, yet far enough away from the urban chaos that the roaring highways were reduced to nothing more than a gentle, distant hum. I was exhausted, my soul felt like sandpaper, my back constantly aching from sleeping on cots that felt like medieval torture devices, carrying a diagnosis of severe PTSD that I never wore as a badge of honor or printed on a t-shirt. A silent, suffocating weight that made crowded spaces, sudden noises, and the feeling of someone standing too close behind me trigger a blinding, visceral panic, which is precisely why sitting in the passenger seat of my rented moving truck that crisp Tuesday morning was Titan, my medically prescribed, extensively trained service dog. Titan is technically a purebred Mastiff mix, but calling him a dog feels like a vast understatement, as he is 130 pounds of dense, unyielding muscle, possessing a massive, blocky head and deep, soulful eyes that make him look like a mythical beast bred to guard the gates of hell to the uninitiated. But to me, he is a lifeline, a gentle giant trained to perform deep pressure therapy when my heart rate spikes into the red zone, to clear rooms before I enter, and to stand passively behind me in lines to create a physical barrier between my shattered nerves and the unpredictable world, making him a federally protected necessity under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and above all else, the only creature on this earth who truly understands the shape of my broken pieces. We pulled into the silent, eerily perfect neighborhood, the kind of place where the air itself feels heavily regulated, and as I was wrestling with the rusted latch of the moving truck's ramp, desperately hoping to just unload my boxes and disappear into my new, quiet life, I heard the faint, high-pitched, electric whine of a golf cart approaching from the pristine street, slowing to a creeping halt right at the edge of my property line. Out stepped Margaret Kensington, marching toward me not with the welcoming stride of a neighbor, but with the rigid, authoritative posture of a mid-level bureaucrat who had never tasted defeat, wearing a violently pink pastel sweater draped over her shoulders and clutching a clipboard that I immediately recognized as a weapon of mass annoyance, her eyes darting from the moving truck to an old, faded oil stain left by the previous owners, before finally settling on me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. Before I could even force a polite, neighborly smile or extend my hand, she was already quoting section and paragraph numbers in a shrill, nasal voice that drilled directly into my temples, informing me that my rental truck was an unauthorized commercial vehicle that needed to be eradicated by nightfall, and that the aesthetic integrity of Cypress Creek Estates was currently under assault by my mere presence. A diatribe I was fully prepared to brush off with a polite nod, right up until the exact moment Titan decided to hop out of the truck's cab, his massive paws hitting the concrete with a heavy, resonant thud, his collar jingling softly as he let out a massive, relaxed yawn. Margaret physically recoiled, her face draining of color, clutching her clipboard to her chest, as if this slow-moving, sweet-tempered animal was a bloodthirsty wolf preparing to tear her throat out, screaming that the community had strict bylaws prohibiting dogs over 40 pounds, absolutely forbidding aggressive breeds, and demanding that the beast be removed from the premises by 5 o'clock or she would summon animal control to seize him, slapping me with a $500 daily fine. For every rotation of the earth he remained on my property. I felt that old, familiar, icy heat rising in my chest, the hyper-focused stillness that precedes a breach, forcing my voice an octave lower as I calmly, deliberately explained that Titan was a highly trained service animal, protected by federal law, exempt from her petty HOA weight restrictions, and that I would happily provide the property management company with the required medical letters. To which she actually laughed, a dry, hacking, condescending sound, mocking my disability by claiming, "Everyone nowadays tries to bring their emotional support iguanas into the neighborhood," pointing a shaking, rage-filled finger at me and declaring that in her community, her rule book superseded any federal mandate, leaving me standing in my driveway, watching her speed off in her little electric cart, realizing with a cold, sinking certainty that I had moved thousands of miles only to find myself standing on the front lines of a brand new, excruciatingly hyper-realistic suburban battlefield. I spent the rest of the day unpacking in a mechanical, furious daze, carefully drafting a highly professional, polite email to Pinnacle Property Management, attaching a letter from my VA psychiatrist and Titan's vaccination records, foolishly believing that somewhere in that corporate chain of command, a rational human being with a basic understanding of the Fair Housing Act would see the documentation, recognize the legal landmine they were dancing on, and force Margaret to stand down, but my lingering faith in humanity was officially crushed at precisely 5:05 that evening, when a private security guard sprinted up my driveway, taped a thick, cream-colored envelope to my front door, and fled as if it were a live grenade. I tore it open, reading the crisp, arrogant font that informed me the board did not recognize psychiatric service animals for inherently dangerous breeds, denying my federal rights in writing, demanding the immediate removal of the dog under threat of escalating fines and severe legal action, forcing me to stand alone in my echoing, half-empty kitchen, staring at a piece of paper that effectively declared war on my sanity, my family, and my freedom, whispering into the silence that if they truly wanted to play this game, I was going to rewrite the rules entirely. The following morning, the harassment began with the kind of synchronized, tactical precision that would make a military commander weep with pride, waking up to find Margaret and a doughy, nervous-looking man named Simon standing on the public sidewalk with a telephoto lens, aggressively documenting Titan simply existing in his own unfenced backyard, screaming that my dog's bodily functions were an unauthorized discharge of biological waste, a health hazard violating yet another obscure bylaw, and promising to rain financial ruin down upon my head, leading to a daily barrage of fines taped to my door like colorful flags of suburban terrorism, $75 for temporary window treatments, $300 for an Amazon truck idling too long, and a recurring $500 for harboring prohibited livestock, pushing my alleged debt to nearly $4,000 in a matter of days. Realizing that reasoning with this woman was like trying to negotiate with a hurricane, and desperately needing a physical barrier to block the hostile stares that pierced through my windows like sniper fire, I searched for the most unapologetic contractor I could find, dialing the number for Marcus's ironclad fencing, speaking to a man named Massive Marcus, who, upon hearing the words Cypress Creek Estates and Margaret Kensington, laughed a deep, gravelly laugh, promising to bring the heavy equipment because he had his own score to settle with the local tyrant who had once fined him for parking his aggressively yellow work truck on the street. When Marcus and his crew arrived, bringing a roaring Bobcat skid-steer loader that shattered the artificial silence of the neighborhood, digging massive holes for a 7-foot, solid cedar privacy fence right on the property line, a structure technically forbidden by the HOA's open space aesthetic rules but legally mandated by county law to secure an allegedly dangerous animal Margaret practically teleported to the scene, skidding her golf cart to a halt, physically jumping out of the moving vehicle and screaming over the diesel engine for us to cease and desist this unauthorized monstrosity, to which I simply tapped the blinking red light of the GoPro strapped to my chest, calmly reminding her that I was merely mitigating the safety hazard she herself had formally declared, warning her that if she stepped one manicured toe onto my grass to stop the construction, she would be trespassing, leaving her trembling with a terrifying, white-hot fury, promising to put a lien on my house and bankrupt me into oblivion as she retreated to plot her next, most unhinged move yet. The true escalation, the twist that elevated this from a petty zoning dispute to a potential criminal nightmare, happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon when I decided to walk Titan, properly vested and leashed, down the public sidewalk, turning a corner near the community park only to find Margaret watering a flower bed, deliberately dropping her hose, wiping her hands, and stepping squarely into our path, crossing her arms and refusing to move, taunting me, baiting me to react, trying to provoke my perfectly still, sitting dog, until she suddenly, inexplicably, and with the dramatic flair of a silent film star, threw herself forcefully onto the manicured grass, flailing her limbs, clutching her ankle, and screaming at the top of her lungs that the beast had attacked her, that I had commanded my dog to kill her, drawing a horrified crowd of neighbors as distant police sirens began to wail. My heart plummeted into my stomach because, in a tragic twist of fate, I had forgotten to turn my GoPro on, standing surrounded by hostile, fearful faces, staring down two approaching police officers who had their hands resting cautiously on their holsters, listening to Margaret sob out an Oscar-worthy performance of a woman fighting for her life, realizing with a sickening clarity that I was about to lose my dog, my freedom, and my home based on the theatrical lies of a bored suburbanite, until a 16-year-old kid named Caleb, wearing an oversized hoodie and an expression of profound teenage apathy, stepped forward holding his iPhone, casually informing the officers that he had been filming a TikTok in the background and had captured the entire thing in glorious, high-definition, vertical video. The officers huddled around the glowing screen, watching the irrefutable evidence of Margaret looking both ways before launching herself through the air like a clumsy gymnast while Titan literally yawned in the background, prompting the older cop to loom over the miraculously healed HOA president, threatening her with a Class 1 misdemeanor for filing a false police report if she didn't get off the ground and walk away immediately. A public humiliation so profound it stripped away her illusion of control, but instead of retreating and reconsidering her life choices, she doubled down, retreating into her bunker and immediately blasting a community-wide email calling for an emergency tribunal to formally initiate foreclosure proceedings on my house. Knowing I was completely out of my depth, I drove into downtown Chicago to secure the services of a notoriously ruthless civil rights attorney named Victor Vance, a man whose office overlooked the skyline and who smiled like a great white shark when I played him the recordings and showed him the written denial of my ADA rights, instructing me to walk into that kangaroo court compliance hearing later that week not as a fighter, but as a sponge, handing me a digital audio recorder and a single piece of paper, a hyper-reasonable, formal request for accommodation, telling me to let them mock it, let them reject it, let them hang themselves with their own arrogance, because we weren't just building a civil lawsuit. We were laying the groundwork to invoke the wrath of the United States Department of Justice. I sat in that dimly lit clubhouse, facing Margaret and her sycophantic board members, remaining utterly calm as she gloated over my impending foreclosure, sliding the formal settlement offer across the table, offering to pay the minor fines if they just waived the ones regarding my medical necessity, only to watch her snatch the document, sneer at my supposed weakness, rip the federal housing request down the middle, and declare into the hidden microphone, with a triumphant, venomous glare, that the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association does not negotiate with terrorists, finalizing her rejection and sealing her own doom, allowing me to walk out into the cool night air, call Victor, and give him the green light to press the big red button. The following Monday morning, the meticulously maintained tranquility of Cypress Creek Estates was shattered not by loud noises or dramatic police raids, but by the slow, terrifying, deeply purposeful arrival of a fleet of black, government-plated SUVs, pulling up to the curb with the heavy weight of inevitable ruin, disgorging a small army of men and women in sharp suits carrying briefcases, led by a woman named Special Agent Reynolds from the DOJ's Housing and Civil Enforcement Section, who looked at Margaret Kensington rushing out in her golf cart to demand they move their unauthorized vehicles, calmly removed her sunglasses, and casually threatened the HOA president with immediate arrest and federal prison time for obstruction of justice if she so much as breathed on a government bumper, freezing Margaret in her tracks and signaling to the entire terrorized neighborhood that the reigning dictator had finally been stripped of her crown. For the next week, the clubhouse transformed into a federal interrogation room where neighbors, smelling blood in the water and realizing they were no longer under threat of retaliation, lined up to confess years of discriminatory fines and targeted harassment, leading the agents to seize the association's laptops, uncovering deeply disturbing, meticulously color-coded spreadsheets where Margaret had rated residents based on race, disability, and their inability to afford legal counsel, culminating in a devastating deposition in a sterile Chicago conference room where a merciless prosecutor named Donovan backed Margaret into a corner, forcing her to arrogantly admit on the record that she believed her private neighborhood rules superseded federal civil rights laws, viewing herself as the supreme voice of the community protecting property values from terrorists like me. The impact of that recorded admission hit like a seismic shockwave when the HOA's liability insurance carrier, invoking the intentional illegal acts exclusion, outright refused to cover the legal defense or the damages, completely dropping the association and exposing the board members to personal financial ruin, causing the entire board to resign in a frantic, sweaty panic, leaving Margaret utterly alone as the federal judge, a man named Judge Harrison Caldwell, who possessed zero patience for petty suburban tyranny, slammed his gavel down and awarded me a staggering $470,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, explicitly stating that because the HOA was effectively bankrupt, the financial burden would fall directly on the corporation's shareholders, the homeowners themselves. The cinematic climax of this entire ordeal arrived not with a bang, but with the rustle of official bankruptcy court letters arriving in every single mailbox on the street, levying a special, mandatory assessment of roughly $6,000 per household to cover the monstrous judgment created by Margaret's unchecked ego, sparking a literal revolution as furious neighbors, who had once silently complied with her madness, marched onto her pristine lawn, dumping garbage bags since the bankrupt HOA could no longer afford trash removal, screaming for her head, and unanimously voting in a tearful, rage-filled creditor meeting to cross-sue Margaret personally for breach of fiduciary duty to cover their massive losses. Stripped of her armor, her allies, and her imaginary power, Margaret Kensington was personally held liable for the devastation, forced to put her beloved, perfect colonial home on the market with a toxic disclosure packet that repelled every normal buyer, eventually bleeding her out until she had no choice but to accept a lowball, insulting, all-cash offer just to avoid jail time, allowing me to stand on my porch on a rainy Tuesday morning, sipping my coffee behind the impenetrable fortress of my cedar fence, with Titan sitting proudly at my side, watching in hyper-realistic, poetic silence as a hollow, broken, profoundly aged Margaret packed the last of her knickknacks into her sedan and drove out of the neighborhood forever, never once looking back at the kingdom she had destroyed. The neighborhood slowly healed, repealing the restrictive breed bans, dissolving the architectural review committees in favor of neighborly potlucks, and allowing the grass to grow a little longer. But the most satisfying, deeply humorous twist of fate occurred a week later when my fence contractor, Massive Marcus, pulled his bright yellow truck into Margaret's old driveway, happily shouting across the street that he was the anonymous cash buyer who had purchased her beloved home for a steal, enthusiastically outlining his plans to paint the pristine front door purple and move his 3 rescue pit bulls in by the weekend, leaving me to walk my giant, world-changing service dog down the street in true, unbothered peace, gazing at the wildflowers now blooming chaotically at the neighborhood entrance. We fought back, we crushed the bully with the unyielding weight of the law, and we restored the soul of a community that had been held hostage by the illusion of aesthetic perfection, But as I sit here now, feeling the deep, rhythmic breathing of Titan resting his massive head on my knee, looking out at a neighborhood that had to suffer a brutal financial purge just to learn how to be human again, a lingering, quiet thought haunts the edges of my mind. If justice requires burning the entire village to the ground just to root out a single tyrant, at what point does righteous self-defense blur into the very same ruthless, unforgiving vengeance we initially set out to defeat?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.